ever get that feeling? Like you need a history book the size of, I don't know, a small car just to understand what's going on in the news today.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Especially when it comes to the Middle East. It's like, where do you even start with untangling that whole global power struggle?
Right.
Well, good news. That's exactly what we're diving into today. We've gone through a ton of fascinating material to kind of connect the dots, starting from that old Great Game rivalry.
Yeah, yeah.
Think 19th and early 20th century, Britain and Russia, like a classic spy versus spy showdown over Central Asia.
Totally.
And then tracing that right into the Cold War, but with a twist. The Persian Gulf becomes the main stage. And there are these really surprising links to the Indo-Pacific that you might not expect.
Yeah, and for those of you who, remember the basics, the Great Game was all about Britain trying to block Russia from getting to the Persian Gulf.
Right.
They were super worried about protecting their route to India. But the really interesting thing is that this tension, this geopolitical chess match, it didn't just vanish after World War II. It kind of morphed, It transformed into that U.S.-Soviet rivalry during the Cold War.
Right, right.
And what we've been looking at really shows how the Americans kind of picked up that strategic playbook, especially as oil became this, undeniable factor in the region.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to unpack that handoff. We're going to focus on those key events, those relationships that were forged.
Yeah.
And, reveal how they set the stage for the Middle East we know today in ways that might surprise you. Think of it as like a crash course in some seriously important history.
Totally.
Okay, let's jump in. So we got to start with a moment that on the surface might seem kind of quiet, even a bit dull, but trust me, it's hugely important.
Okay.
We're talking about this super secret meeting between President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Ibn Saud, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia.
Right.
This is back in February 1945.
And the secrecy surrounding this encounter is fascinating right from the start. You've got FDR returning from the Yalta Conference, where they were literally redrawing the map of the post-war world.
Right. Yeah.
And this meeting with the Saudi king had to be kept so hush-hush, especially with the war in Europe still going on. That really tells you something about how important this was. It was like a tiny circle of people on each side even knew about it.
Yeah.
Like the USS Murphy, the ship that brought Ibn Saud, its arrival in Jeddah, was totally played down.
Mm-hmm.
And even Ibn Saud's trip from Mecca was super carefully managed. It was almost like a secret diplomatic mission.
It sounds like something straight out of a Cold War spy movie.
Right.
But this was like years before the Cold War really got going.
Yeah.
And the lengths they went to. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that staged dinner at the American legation just to throw people off the scent.
Right.
And apparently FDR didn't even tell Churchill what was up. It's kind of wild, right?
It really shows you how global power dynamics were shifting. You can almost feel Churchill's frustration being left out of the loop about a region that Britain still considered, their turf.
Totally. He was so annoyed that he then scrambled to set up his own meetings with regional leaders.
Yeah, he met with Ibn Saud, King Farouk of Egypt, Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. He was playing catch-up.
Wow, that's fascinating. So if we zoom out a bit, what does this tell us?
Well, I think it shows that the U.S. was recognizing the growing strategic importance of the Middle East even before they fully grasped just how important oil would become.
Right.
Now, the meeting itself took place on the USS Quincy, which is quite a setting.
Yeah.
You have these two very different leaders from completely different worlds, but they actually found some common ground.
Like what?
They were both at similar points in their lives and careers, both carrying the weight of leadership, but also they had these unexpected similarities, like an interest in farming and dealing with physical limitations. And FDR actually gave Ibn Saud a wheelchair as a gift, which apparently Ibn Saud really treasured.
Really? That's so interesting.
Yeah, it kind of shows that they were forming a personal bond, even in the middle of this really high-stakes diplomacy.
But it wasn't all just, handshakes and photo ops, right? They had to get down to business.
Oh, absolutely.
And a big topic was Palestine. And that's where things get a little, tense.
Yeah, definitely.
FDR asked Ibn Saud for his support regarding Jewish refugees who wanted to settle in Palestine. And Ibn Saud's response was a firm no. Absolutely not.
He argued that it should be Germany, the country responsible for the Holocaust, who should provide restitution, not the Arab nations.
Right.
He even proposed that the refugees should be distributed proportionally among all the allied nations.
Huh. So what's the takeaway here?
Well, I think even at this early stage, you can see the seeds of future conflict being planted. These were two completely different perspectives on justice and responsibility.
Yeah, definitely.
Ibn Saud was expressing a deep-seated Arab sentiment, while FDR was trying to balance that with his own domestic political realities back in the U.S.
Right. He had to think about his voters, too.
Exactly. And this is where it's really interesting. FDR promised Ibn Saud that the U.S. wouldn't do anything against Arab interests or change its policy on Palestine without talking to him first.
Oh, okay.
But when Truman took over, that promise, well, it didn't exactly hold up. And that raises a really important question about the lasting impact of broken promises in international relations.
It's like, how can you build trust when those kinds of agreements just get tossed aside?
Exactly.
And it wasn't that long after,
Yeah.
right? In October 1945, just a few months later, Truman basically ignored Arab concerns and focused on what Zionist voters back in the U.S. wanted.
Yeah.
That was a huge policy shift, and it really alienated the Arab world. It totally undermined the trust that FDR had worked so hard to build.
It really does make you wonder, what if things had gone differently?
Right. What if that trust had been maintained?
Ex-
But let's move beyond that one meeting for a minute. If we look at the broader picture, at the economics and the overall strategy, even though Saudi Arabia wasn't producing a ton of oil in 1945, everyone could see that it had massive potential.
Oh, absolutely.
William Eddy, the guy who helped set up the Roosevelt-Ibn Saud meeting, remember him?
Yeah.
Well, he later became a consultant for Aramco, the Arabian-American oil company.
Right.
And he totally understood just how much oil was under those Saudi sands. And Ibn Saud, he was open to American technology, even things like water pumps to help with farming.
Yeah, he saw the benefits of modernization.
Right, exactly. And that paved the way for Aramco to expand, and it locked in this really crucial oil supply for the U.S. in the long run.
And that's a key point. That meeting between FDR and Ibn Saud essentially laid the foundation for this really long-lasting U.S.-Saudi alliance.
It all comes back to that meeting, huh?
In a way, yeah. It was this powerful combination of American strategic interests and Saudi Arabia's vital oil reserves. And Eddy's continued involvement with Aramco and the development of the Trans-Arabian pipeline, those are perfect examples of this growing interdependence.
Right.
By the 1950s, Saudi oil was basically a lifeline for the U.S. economy.
Wow.
And even though there were those early bumps in the road with the whole Palestine issue, that core alliance somehow managed to survive the Cold War and all the regional upheavals that came with it.
It's incredible how resilient that relationship has been. So, what do we learn from this?
Well, maybe that alliances built on shared strategic and economic interests can be incredibly strong, even when there are major political disagreements.
Yeah, it's like sometimes those practical considerations outweigh everything else.
Exactly. And it's also interesting to think about the symbolism of this alliance. For some in the U.S., it represented this potential for a moral and strategic alignment in the Middle East, a way to push back against communism around the world.
Right.
But you can also see why Britain and France might have been a little nervous about all this.
Why is that?
The U.S. was clearly becoming a major player in a region that they had long considered part of their sphere of influence.
Right.
It was a sign of things to come, the inevitable changes brought about by decolonization.
Yeah, the world was changing fast. But let's back up for a second. We need to remember that this meeting between FDR and Ibn Saud didn't happen in a vacuum. It came right after the Yalta Conference, where the Allied powers were basically carving up the post-war world.
Right, yeah.
The Soviet Union's ambitions were becoming super obvious, and you could already see those early signs of the Cold War brewing.
Totally.
And FDR making that detour to meet with Ibn Saud, that was a clear sign that the U.S. was thinking beyond Europe.
Absolutely.
They were looking to make strategic alliances in this new global contest.
It was a key shift. The U.S. was actively stepping in to establish its influence in areas that had previously been dominated by European powers.
Yeah, it's like they were saying, hey, we're here now, and we're going to be a major player.
Exactly. And Palestine, as we've already talked about, quickly became this major Cold War flashpoint. Ibn Saud's initial and, unwavering rejection of large-scale Jewish settlement, and then the U.S. decision to back the creation of Israel in 1948 without really considering Arab perspectives, that created a lot of resentment across the Arab world.
Yeah, you can understand why they felt betrayed.
Absolutely. And the Soviets, always looking for a way to undermine the West, they were quick to capitalize on this. They started supporting Arab nationalist movements, like Nasser's Egypt, to gain a foothold in the region.
It was a classic Cold War move, taking advantage of existing tensions to further their own goals. So where does Saudi Arabia fit into all of this?
Well, it was in a super crucial position in this emerging Cold War landscape. Its massive oil reserves and its location right between the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, those were vital shipping lanes, made it a linchpin.
Right, like a strategic choke point.
Exactly. And remember William Eddy.
The Aramco guy.
Yep, he kept working with Aramco during those early Cold War years, mainly to ensure that the oil kept flowing to the U.S. and its NATO allies. That was essential for countering the Soviet Union's industrial and military power.
Right, it was all about keeping the West supplied.
Exactly. And by the mid-1950s, even though Saudi Arabia wasn't officially a member, it had clearly aligned itself with the U.S.-led anti-communist bloc, especially when it came to pushing back against those Soviet-aligned states in the region.
Okay, so let's talk about how the U.S. tried to build this wall against Soviet expansion, especially in Iraq and Iran. The idea was to create a kind of southern security belt around the Soviet Union.
Right.
And a big part of that was the 1955 Baghdad Pact, which later became CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization.
Yeah.
It was spearheaded by the U.S. and Britain, and it brought together Iraq, which was under a pro-Western monarchy at the time, along with Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, and the UK.
Right.
Their goal was to block the Soviets from getting into the Middle East.
This wasn't just some symbolic agreement either. They were doing joint military planning, sharing intelligence. It was serious business.
Wow, so the U.S. was really committed to this strategy.
They were. But as we know, the Soviets were busy cultivating those Arab nationalist movements that were opposed to these Western-backed monarchies.
Right.
And a great example of how far the U.S. was willing to go to stop Soviet influence is the 1953 coup in Iran. The CIA and MI6 worked together to overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh and put the Shah back in power.
Yeah, that was a pretty controversial move.
Oh, absolutely. But the U.S. was genuinely worried that the Soviets would take control of Iran's oil and exploit its long border with the USSR, especially after Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company.
Right, that was a direct challenge to Western control over those resources. It was a classic Cold War power play.
Exactly. And then the Shah, with all that U.S. aid, he was able to modernize his military really quickly.
And unsurprisingly, Iran joined the Baghdad Pact in 1955.
Right. By the 1970s, with the oil boom, Iran had become a major regional military power. They had all this advanced U.S. weaponry, and they were effectively serving as a counterweight to those Soviet-backed regimes in the area.
And internally, the Shah's regime was cracking down on any communist or leftist groups they thought might be sympathetic to the Soviets.
Right, with the help of the Savak, the secret police.
Okay, so here's where things get a little unexpected.
Mm.
Apparently, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was a fierce critic of the Shah and his close ties to the U.S., he actually reached out to the Kennedy administration back in 1963.
Yeah, there are declassified documents that suggest that.
And despite all his fiery anti-American speeches, he supposedly told the U.S. that he wasn't against American interests in Iran.
Right.
And he even saw the U.S. presence as a potential way to balance out Soviet and British influence.
It's a bit mind-blowing considering what happened later.
Right. It really makes you question the whole narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like even in the middle of this ideological conflict, there were still these pragmatic considerations about power and regional balance at play.
Yeah, it's like realpolitik in action. Okay, let's fast forward to the late 1970s. Things in Iran were getting really messy.
Oh, yeah.
And this cable, Thinking the Unthinkable, written by Ambassador William Sullivan in November 1978, it really captures this sense of crisis.
Yeah, it's a famous document now.
Khomeini was in exile in Paris. His message was spreading through Iran like wildfire, and the Shah was losing control fast.
Right.
Sullivan realized how precarious the Shah's position was and how everything could change really quickly. So he came up with this bold and maybe kind of risky plan
What was that?
to help the Shah leave Iran and then try to work with Khomeini and parts of the Iranian military.
Wow, that was a pretty big gamble.
Yeah, it was. Sullivan was basically trying to salvage some level of U.S. influence in this rapidly changing situation.
Right.
But Carter wasn't so sure. The Shah had been a reliable ally, a key part of their strategy to contain the Soviets.
Yeah, it was a tough call.
Abandoning him would have huge geopolitical consequences. But as we know, that hesitation ended up costing them.
Yeah, it did. By the time Carter finally agreed to let the Shah leave in January 1979, they called it his Californian vacation.
A vacation?
The momentum had totally shifted to Khomeini's side.
Yeah.
He came back to Iran in February, and a new era began.
It's not like the U.S. just sat back and watched all this happen. They were trying to engage with Khomeini even while he was still in Paris.
They were exploring options, seeing if they could find some common ground for the future.
And Khomeini, he actually sent messages to Washington through the American embassy in Paris.
Really? What did he say?
He said he didn't have any hatred towards Americans, that he would create a humanitarian government, that Iran would keep selling oil, and even that American companies could invest in Iran.
It's wild to think about those messages now, knowing how things turned out.
Right. It just shows how unpredictable things were.
But even with those messages, Khomeini still deeply distrusted the Soviet Union. And that distrust had deep historical roots.
Yeah, it's not like the Soviets had been great neighbors to Iran.
Not at all. Iran had been this battleground for Russian and Soviet ambitions for centuries. They'd lost territory during the Qajar dynasty. There was that Soviet-backed Azerbaijan crisis in 1946, and then those intervention clauses in the 1921 Soviet-Iranian treaty. All of that created this lasting suspicion.
It's like a long history of betrayal and interference.
Yeah, exactly. And then the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and there were rumors that they were meddling in Iraq, too.
Right, that didn't help.
Not at all. And ideologically, Khomeini's vision of an Islamic state was totally opposed to Soviet atheism and communism.
So even though Khomeini was against the U.S., he saw the Soviets as an even bigger threat.
Exactly. And the Soviets didn't exactly handle the situation well either.
Like, what did they do?
Their ambassador, right after meeting Khomeini, he reaffirmed that 1921 treaty, the one with those intervention clauses.
Oh, wow, that's not a good look.
Not at all. It just made Iran even more worried about Soviet intentions.
Yeah, talk about a diplomatic blunder.
Right. And then they tried to reassure Iran, but it just didn't ring true, especially with the war in Afghanistan raging on. By the fall of 1979, the Soviet media was openly attacking the idea of an Islamic state and criticizing Khomeini directly.
So they basically destroyed any chance of a good relationship.
Yeah, pretty much. And that probably pushed Khomeini further away from any kind of deal with them.
And then, of course, there was the U.S. embassy takeover in Tehran in November 1979. That solidified Iran's stance against both the U.S. and the Soviets. They were determined to be independent.
It was a huge turning point.
It was. And despite all the worries that some of America's Arab allies had about a communist takeover in Iran, Khomeini ultimately cracked down on leftist movements within the country.
Yeah, he wasn't going to let anyone challenge his authority, whether they were pro-U.S. or pro-Soviet.
And get this. In 1983, the CIA gave Khomeini's government a list of members of the Tudeh Party, the Iranian Communist Party.
Really? How did they get that?
Well, some of it came from a KGB defector through British intelligence.
Wow.
And this led to mass arrests, imprisonments, executions. It basically destroyed the Tudeh Party.
It's kind of crazy the U.S. was working with a regime they oppose, just to undermine the Soviets. It shows how important that goal was to them.
Yeah, it's a pretty complex situation, morally speaking. But let's shift gears now and talk about Iraq. It's another great example of how alliances shifted during the Cold War and all the maneuvering that went on.
Okay, yeah.
So Iraq was initially part of that U.S.-backed Baghdad Pact, which obviously annoyed the Soviets and their allies like Nasser's Egypt.
Right. It was seen as a direct challenge to their influence.
But that pro-Western Iraqi monarchy wasn't very stable. And in 1958, there was a coup led by Abd al-Karim Qasim.
Right.
They overthrew the monarchy, pulled Iraq out of the Baghdad Pact, and declared neutrality.
Wow, that was a big shift.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
And they started accepting Soviet aid, both economic and military.
That must have set off alarm bells in Washington.
Oh, absolutely. Iraq was strategically located, had lots of oil, and now it seemed to be tilting towards the Soviets. So what did the U.S. do? They strengthened their ties with Iran and Saudi Arabia, basically trying to surround Iraq and limit Soviet influence.
It's like a geopolitical game of chess.
Right, exactly. And there's evidence that the CIA supported anti-Qasim groups in Iraq, including Kurdish rebels, to try and destabilize his regime.
That's not surprising. The U.S. was known for doing that kind of thing during the Cold War.
Yeah, as part of their playbook.
Mm.
And then in 1961, Iraq started nationalizing parts of its oil industry, which was a threat to Western oil companies.
So the stakes got even higher.
Exactly. And when the Ba'ath Party, which was anti-communist, took power at a coup in 1963, the U.S. was at least okay with it, if not directly involved.
They saw the Ba'athists as the lesser of two evils, basically.
Right, anything to keep the Soviets out. But Iraq didn't immediately become a U.S. ally. Under the Ba'ath Party, they actually got closer to the Soviets.
Yeah, that's right.
They signed a Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation in 1972, which led to lots of Soviet arms and advisors in Iraq. And then they nationalized their whole oil industry. aligning themselves even more with the Soviet bloc.
So for a while, it seemed like the Soviets were winning in Iraq.
But then Saddam Hussein came to power in 1979, and he was a bit of a wild card.
What do you mean?
He relied heavily on Soviet weapons, but he didn't trust communists. He purged them from his party and wanted to maintain Iraq's independence.
So he was playing both sides.
In a way, yeah. And here's another twist. In the early 1970s, the U.S., Iran, and even Israel were supporting Kurdish rebels in Iraq.
Really? Why?
They wanted to weaken the Soviet-backed Ba'athist regime. It's like everyone's playing this complex game of alliances and betrayals.
It's dizzying.
It is. But then, in the late 1970s, the U.S. started engaging with Saddam Hussein directly. They wanted to lessen his dependence on the Soviets and maybe make it more neutral.
So the U.S. was trying to pull Iraq back into their orbit.
Exactly. And then, in 1980, the Iran-Iraq War broke out.
And that changed everything.
It did. The Soviets, as you might expect, supported Iraq. They sent them weapons, advisors, and economic aid. They saw it as a chance to weaken Iran and expand their influence in the Persian Gulf.
Right.
But the U.S., they had a completely different approach. They were now at odds with Iran after the revolution and the hostage crisis, so they actually started supporting Iraq.
Wow. So they were backing the same side as the Soviets.
Yeah, it was all about countering Soviet influence. They provided Iraq with intelligence, helped them get dual-use technology, gave them agricultural credits, and encouraged their allies to arm Iraq.
That's incredible.
And to make things even more complicated, the U.S. was also secretly selling arms to Iran at the same time. It was this whole thing called the Iran-Contra affair.
So they were playing both sides against the middle.
Exactly. The U.S. wanted the war to drag on because they thought it would weaken both Iran and Iraq and therefore reduce Soviet influence in the region. It was Cold War realpolitik at its most cynical.
It's pretty mind-boggling.
It really is. So, to wrap things up, we've gone from the shadow of the Great Game to the complexities of the Cold War in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's been a long journey.
We've seen how that meeting between FDR and Ibn Saud set the stage for this long-lasting, even though sometimes rocky, relationship between the U.S. and the Middle East. We've explored all these alliances, betrayals, and the different ways the U.S. tried to contain the Soviets, and we've seen how those actions had consequences that are still being felt today.
It's a lot to process.
It is. So, for me, the most surprising thing is probably that early secret communication between Khomeini and the U.S. It shows that things weren't always as black and white as they seemed.
Yeah, and the whole Iran-Iraq war situation with the U.S. supporting both sides at different times, that's pretty wild, too.
Absolutely. So, for you listening, understanding this history is crucial if you want to make sense of what's going on in the Middle East today and how it's all connected to global power struggles in the 21st century.
And it leaves us with a big question. Given all this history of outside powers meddling in the region, what are the chances of real stability and self-determination in the Middle East?
Right. Is that even possible?
And what lessons can we learn from the Cold War, from both the successes and, more often, the failures, as we try to navigate the challenges of today's world?
It's someone to think about for sure.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.
All right. So, when you're trying to understand what is happening on a global level,
Right.
it can feel really, really overwhelming.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
There's so many different things going on, so many players, so many different moving pieces. Today, we're going to be talking about the Great Game.
Oh, the Great Game.
Yeah. So when we talk about the Great Game, what we're really talking about is this competition for influence in really vital regions of the world.
Yeah.
And the biggest Great Game going on today is that between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't just some new thing that has popped up. It's really, it has echoes throughout history. You can go back, to the 19th and 20th centuries. We had the British Empire and Russia, and they were kind of locked in their own version of this great game. They were really competing for control of Central Asia.
Right.
And, they really wanted these warm water ports.
Right. And that's something that we see time and time again. A consistent theme in all of this is the U.S. really wanting to make sure that no single power is able to gain control of the Persian Gulf or the Indian Ocean.
Absolutely. And, this historical context, it's not just, some interesting little historical tidbit. It's actually really, really important for understanding what the U.S. is doing right now today.
Yeah.
When you see them trying to counter China's influence in places like Iran and Pakistan and Myanmar, what you're really seeing is a new chapter in this very, very long game. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to try to really, unpack and understand what strategies they're using in those very places pieces. We'll be drawing on, a bunch of different sources. We'll be talking about some remarks from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And, we're just going to really get into it.
Yeah, it should be fun. Let's jump in. So something that I think is really interesting about this whole great game concept is how the U.S. strategy during the Cold War,
Right.
where they were very actively trying to destabilize regimes that were pro-Soviet, particularly in the Middle East. It's almost like they were drawing from the playbook of the British Empire, who were trying to do similar things in their own great game against Russia.
Yeah, there is this underlying logic, I think, in geopolitics that has persisted for centuries.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that, established powers really don't want any one power to become too strong and control key strategic routes and things like that.
Yeah, and that was something that was, it wasn't just a vague idea.
Right.
We saw it in a very clear way. After 9/11, General Wesley Clark, he actually made some comments where he listed all of these countries that were pro-Soviet, that were essentially targeted for regime change.
Yeah.
Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Sudan, Syria, Iran.
Yeah.
And if you look back at what happened since then, many of those regimes actually have been toppled through various means.
Yeah.
It was a very deliberate policy objective on the part of the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture here, this dynamic between the U.S. and China today can really be seen as a continuation of that. It's kind of like Cold War 2.0.
Right.
And, the U.S. initially, they supported China as a counterbalance to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But there was a shift.
Yeah.
There was a shift. And the article, Rise of China as Techno-Industrial Power, really pinpoints this.
Yeah.
China, it evolved into a powerful techno-industrial force, something the Soviets never achieved.
Yeah.
And that has really captured the attention of Washington and is driving this renewed sense of competition.
So with that in mind, let's talk about Iran specifically.
Okay.
This is such a complex situation because you have decades of this hostility.
Yeah.
And there are no diplomatic ties since the revolution in '79.
Right.
So it's a completely different situation than what we see with the U.S. relationship with Pakistan.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that China has sort of stepped into this vacuum. You see these ties between China and Iran, they're becoming deeper all the time, both economically and strategically. The most notable example is this 25-year cooperation agreement.
Yeah.
And, it could potentially involve as much as $400 billion of investment in Iran. That's in Iran's energy sector, infrastructure, and even military capabilities.
Right.
And that's a substantial lifeline for Iran, especially when you consider how much pressure they're under from U.S. sanctions.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the U.S. wants to use these sanctions to cripple Iran's nuclear program, but what it's actually doing is it's kind of pushing Iran further and further into the arms of China.
So it's into that orbit.
Yeah, it's not exactly the result that they wanted.
And it really shows you the limitations of unilateral economic coercion.
Yeah, because those sanctions, while they're meant to isolate Iran, they haven't actually stopped China from working with them.
Yeah.
We still see imports of Iranian oil. Often it's disguised, through these ship-to-ship transfers, which is where oil is moved between vessels at sea to try to avoid detection.
Right.
And our sources say that these transfers were at record levels last year in 2023. So that's a really clear sign that China's willing to kind of work around these measures that the U.S. has put in place.
Yeah, they are willing to do what it takes to secure their energy needs and also to support a very strategic partner.
Right. And this is something that we need to think about when we talk about the U.S. approach.
Yeah.
They're so focused on sanctions and diplomatic pressure.
Right.
And this maximum pressure campaign, it's intended to, stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
But what it's also doing is it's pushing Iran closer to China. And the U.S. has tried to persuade its allies, like India, to reduce their reliance on Iranian oil, but they haven't had that much success.
Right.
So it shows how hard it is to get all these different countries on the same page.
It shows how hard it is to really enforce these kinds of broad sanctions unilaterally.
Yeah. And the U.S. also has a big military presence in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
And they do a lot of joint exercises with their partners in the region. And that's a very deliberate signal. It's meant to deter. But it hasn't stopped China from getting involved diplomatically.
Right.
And we saw that really clearly in 2023.
Yeah.
When China actually helped broker a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
That was a big one.
Yeah, and that was a major shift
Mm-hmm.
in the region, and it showed that China is a player now.
Yeah, they're a major diplomatic force.
Yeah, and the U.S. has responded to that and to all of China's activity in the region
Yeah.
with even more sanctions. There were new ones announced just at the beginning of this year in 2025.
Yeah.
And those were targeting companies and entities in China, India, and the UAE
Yeah.
that were involved in shipping Iranian oil.
Yeah. And the latest round of those was announced in March of 2025. Those targeted a Chinese refinery specifically, Shandong Shuguang Luking Petrochemical Co., Ltd.
Yeah.
And they were sanctioned for buying and refining Iranian crude oil.
Yeah.
And some of that oil was linked to Houthi vessels and Iran's Ministry of Defense.
Wow.
So that's pretty significant.
Yeah.
They also sanctioned the Huang Huizhou Diabei petrochemical terminal storage.
Right.
That was for storing Iranian crude.
So they're really trying to cut off.
Yeah, they're trying to disrupt this flow of resources.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Pakistan.
Okay.
And this is a very different situation than Iran, because here we've seen Pakistan moving very decisively towards China in recent years.
Yeah, and the driving force behind that is really clear. It's the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor.
Right. CPEC.
Yeah, CPEC. This is a huge investment.
Yep.
$62 billion.
Wow.
And it's really a transformative project. It's directly linking China to the Arabian Sea.
Right.
And it's going to do that through energy projects, the strategic port of Gwadar, and a whole bunch of extensive highway infrastructure.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
It's a really big deal.
Yeah.
And, the key takeaway here isn't just about the amount of money involved.
Yeah.
It's about this creation of fundamental economic dependence.
Right.
This is something that potentially could lock Pakistan into China's orbit in a way that traditional U.S. aid never could.
Right. And as this project has become more and more important, the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan has really suffered.
It's cooled off.
Yeah, especially in the period after 2011.
Right.
When we had the raid to get bin Laden and then the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that was a real turning point.
Yeah.
The U.S. no longer needed Pakistan as much as they did before.
And you see that reflected in statements like the one from the Pakistani foreign minister back in 2022.
Right.
Where he actually called China his country's second home.
Wow.
That wasn't just him.
Right.
That really reflects a broader consensus among the political and military establishment there in Pakistan.
Yeah. And the U.S. has tried to push back against this growing alignment. They've raised concerns about CPEC.
Yeah, they're worried about the debt.
Yeah, they say you're going to get into too much debt. And, of course, by 2023, Pakistan's external debt was $130 billion.
It's massive.
And China was the biggest creditor.
Yeah.
So that's a big deal.
Yeah, and they tried to kind of offer some incentives as well.
Right.
There was this F-16 upgrade package in 2022.
Right.
And they've consistently supported IMF bailouts for Pakistan.
Yeah.
Maybe hoping that economic leverage might, kind of create some distance between Islamabad and Beijing.
Yeah.
But, despite all that, Pakistan increasingly sees China as a more reliable partner.
Yeah.
And you can really see that when you look at the decline in U.S. aid over the past couple of decades.
So that's another place where the U.S. strategy is really being challenged.
It is. And it raises questions about whether it's even viable in the long term.
Right.
Quiet counterterrorism cooperation might be one avenue because, they do have shared concerns about instability in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
But it's a difficult balancing act.
It is.
Especially when you consider how much influence China has economically.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to Myanmar now.
Okay.
This is another situation that is just so incredibly complex.
It is.
Especially since the 2021 coup.
Yeah, it's become incredibly fluid.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating in Myanmar is China's long-standing and dominant influence there.
Yeah.
Even before the coup, they had made these huge investments, like the Kyaukphyu port and these oil and gas pipelines that give China direct access to the Indian Ocean.
Right.
And, the really important thing about those pipelines is they allow China to bypass the Strait of Malacca.
Right.
And since the coup, China's had this nuanced strategy. On the one hand, they're backing the junta because that maintains stability along their border.
Right.
But they're also engaging with all these ethnic armed groups in the border region.
Yeah, it's hedging their bets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're playing it very smart.
Yeah. And the U.S. approach has been totally different. They've focused on sanctions against the junta
Right.
and, symbolic support for the democratic opposition.
Yeah, like the national unity government.
Right.
But it hasn't really had much of an effect.
Yeah, it hasn't changed the junta's behavior,
No?
and it hasn't diminished China's influence.
Right, right.
So it's interesting to see how the U.S. is adapting
Mm-hmm.
to this new reality. They've started to increase humanitarian aid,
Yeah.
and they're engaging with these resistance groups very quietly behind the scenes.
Very quietly.
Yeah, and they've been very careful to not give direct military aid.
Yeah, they don't want to provoke Beijing.
Right, because that would cause problems.
Yeah.
But in 2022, they passed the Biram Act,
Oh.
and that authorized non-lethal support. So they're signaling that they want to push back against the junta and China's interests,
Right.
but they're trying to do it very carefully.
Without crossing certain lines.
Yeah.
And it seems like the goal here might be to use this instability in Myanmar
Yeah.
to disrupt China's Belt and Road Initiative projects.
Yeah.
And there have been reports of resistance groups in Shan State making gains and threatening key trade routes there.
Yeah. But it sounds like China's adapting pretty well to this situation.
They are. They're supporting the junta while also keeping channels open
Yeah.
with these rebel groups on the border.
Yeah.
And their economic influence is still their big advantage.
Yeah. They have a lot of leverage.
Yeah.
So if we take a step back and we look at the big picture,
Yeah.
the U.S. is using a lot of different tools.
Mm-hmm.
They're using sanctions, they're doing military exercises, they're using diplomatic pressure, they're even considering working with non-state actors.
Yeah,
But it feels like they're playing catch-up.
it does.
Yeah, they're reacting to what China's doing rather than setting the agenda.
Yeah. And a big part of their strategy seems to be to try and restrict China's access,
Yeah.
whether that's by disrupting trade corridors
Mhm.
or by limiting their access to key technologies.
Right, things like computer chips and things like that.
Exactly, yeah, like semiconductors and GPUs. But when you compare that to China's strategy,
Yeah.
they're willing to invest heavily in infrastructure and development,
Yeah.
and they don't attach all these political conditions like
Uh-huh.
Western aid often does.
Yeah.
And that gives them a huge advantage, especially in developing countries. I mean, just look at the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
Over $130 billion invested in all these different projects.
It's a lot of money.
It's a huge amount of money, and
Yeah.
it shows how ambitious they are.
Yeah. And it also shows that they're in it for the long haul.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the sources that we looked at, they point out that there are a lot of factors that really favor China in Asia right now. Things like Iran's anti-Americanism,
Yeah.
Pakistan's dependence on China economically,
Yeah.
and Russia's increasing trade with Beijing.
All of that is creating an environment where China's influence can grow.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about how all of this is affecting Iran's influence.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of things going on that could potentially weaken them.
Right.
You have the maximum pressure campaign from
Yeah.
the U.S., which has continued even under the Biden administration.
Mm.
You have Israel doing these military operations in Gaza and Lebanon,
Yeah.
and there are still efforts going on to try to overthrow Assad in Syria.
Right.
So if Iran is weakened,
Yeah.
that raises the question of what happens next.
Yeah, it could lead to more instability in the region.
Right.
Really could. I mean, imagine if there was a military attack on Iran's nuclear facilities
Yeah.
or a major regime change operation. It could unleash chaos across the whole Middle East.
Yeah, and that's something that the U.S. is really worried about because they don't want to see a situation where that chaos allows China to gain even more access to the Persian Gulf,
Yeah.
especially through their ties with Iran and their investment in Gwadar port.
Exactly. That's their strategic nightmare.
Yeah. And there are rumors that the U.S. is considering some pretty extreme measures.
Really?
Yeah. They're talking about using Israel against Iran
Wow.
and maybe even working with blow-sheet separatist groups.
To target Chinese investments.
Yeah. So they're thinking about using these non-state actors
Yeah.
to achieve their goals, which is really risky.
It is very risky.
But it shows how far they're willing to go.
Yeah.
And their approach to India and Pakistan,
Yeah.
it's really a balancing act.
It is.
They're trying to build up India as an economic ally
Yeah.
to contain China in the Indian Ocean and the Malacca Straits.
Right.
But at the same time, they're trying to maintain ties with the Pakistani military, maybe hoping that they could eventually pull them away from China.
Right.
The ultimate goal here for the U.S. is to stop China
Yeah.
from getting access to the Persian Gulf through the Belt and Road Initiative and CPEC.
Yeah.
And it seems like they're trying to do that on two fronts.
Right.
India is their guy in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
And then they're using proxies and regional partners to deal with China's land-based access through Pakistan and Iran.
It's a complex strategy.
It is. So let's talk a little bit about what Secretary of State Marco Rubio had to say about all of this.
Yeah.
He did an interview on March 19th of this year.
Yeah.
And he was very clear about the challenge that China poses to the U.S.
What really struck me in his comments was just how certain he was that China is the biggest challenge facing the U.S. right now. He believes that China thinks it's going to become a global power and that that's inevitable.
Right.
And their main goal is to manage that rise.
Yeah.
So there are no disruptions.
Yeah. And he didn't pull any punches
when
he was talking about China not playing by the rules.
Right.
When it comes to trade and intellectual property and all of that.
That's a major concern for him.
Yeah. And, for a long time, there was this idea that as China's economy grew, they would become more like us.
More democratic.
Yeah.
But he acknowledged that that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And that the U.S. has to engage with a China that is both economically powerful and ideologically different.
Yeah.
And that means the U.S. needs to completely change its strategy.
Right.
So it's not overly dependent on China.
Yeah.
But it's still finding areas where they can engage.
Yeah. That's a really important point.
It is. Yeah. He's saying we can't assume that economic liberalization will automatically lead to political change. Yeah. And that's a big shift in how the U.S. is thinking about China.
So when we put all this together, it seems like the U.S. strategy, while it does seem to be well thought out, it's facing some huge obstacles.
It is.
And the outcome is far from certain.
Yeah. And that's the really striking thing here, you know? Despite all the strategy and planning, there's no guarantee that the U.S. will be able to stop China's influence from growing in these vital regions. You know, the Great Game, it rarely goes according to plan.
No, it doesn't.
Things change.
Yeah.
Alliances shift. Unforeseen events happen.
Right.
And that can completely change everything.
So to sum up what we've talked about today,
the
U.S. is using a lot of different tactics to try to counter China.
Yeah.
In Iran, Pakistan, and Myanmar. They're using sanctions, they're using their military, they're putting diplomatic pressure on these countries, and they're even thinking about using non-state actors.
Right.
And this is all part of this new great game that's being played out between the U.S. and China.
A new chapter.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that all of these things are connected.
Yeah.
What happens in one part of the world,
it
has consequences in other parts of the world.
It creates ripples.
It's all connected.
And if we want to understand what's going on in the world today, we need to understand the history. We need to understand the strategic interests of the different players.
Right.
And we need to understand the challenges and the opportunities that exist in each region.
Absolutely. If you want to analyze the global landscape, you have to start there.
So we've covered a lot today.
We have.
And it's a lot to think about.
It is.
But we want to leave you with something to really ponder. You know, we've talked about all these historical parallels and all the challenges and all the strategies.
Yeah.
So think about this. What are the long-term consequences of this new Cold War for global stability and the balance of power?
Good question.
Yeah. What are the things that we don't see coming, you know? What are the technological advancements or the changes in domestic politics in these countries that could really change everything?
Yeah, what are those wild cards?
Yeah, that we're not even thinking about right now.
Yeah, because this is a complex and ever-changing situation.
It is.
And it has implications for all of us.
For the future of the world, really.
Yeah. So think about it.
Yeah.
And let us know what you think.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Until next time.
Take care.
See ya.
Wow. The global stage is a wild place right now. You can't help but notice the absolute clash of the titans happening between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, it's a real head-to-head.
And one of our listeners sent in some fascinating stuff that even called it a battle royale for like total domination in tech and industry. You know, since their curiosity brought this stuff to us, I think that's exactly where we should dive in.
I agree.
This whole escalating competition between these two superpowers, you know, especially in tech and AI. What do you think?
Sounds good. It's not just about who gets the biggest headlines. It's really about how the whole tech landscape is being totally reshaped. What's really interesting is how much money is being poured into this, like the distinct strategies each country is using.
Right, like are we going to end up in some sci-fi movie scenario?
And that's really what we're here to do today, isn't it? Let's try to break down the core ideas from all this stuff our listeners sent in. What are the main things happening? What's really at stake?
Right, without getting totally lost in the weeds.
Exactly. Big picture stuff and the really interesting specific details, too.
Okay, so to start unpacking all this, let's look at the core motivation. Like, why is this competition so fierce?
Yeah.
What we've seen in all this material is basically the U.S. sees China's fast rise as a threat to their global standing and their tech leadership, really.
Yeah, for sure. And some of what you sent over even echoes what I hear Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been saying, about how power is shifting.
It makes you think of how the British Empire must have felt, right? Watching the world change around them.
Exactly. And there's this real sense in the U.S. that they not only need to hold on to their position, but really fight to reclaim the top spot in these crucial tech industries and trade, absolutely.
It's not just about keeping things the same if that means getting overtaken by China, especially in AI.
Exactly.
They want to get that edge back.
Totally. And to do that, both sides are spending huge amounts of money, especially in AI.
Oh, yeah.
It's mind-blowing, really. It's not just the amount, though. It's how they're spending it. Our sources say the Bank of China is supposedly putting 1 trillion yuan over the next 5 years toward making China self-reliant in technology.
Wow, 1 trillion.
Yeah, and about 300 billion yuan of that is specifically going towards AI infrastructure, like equity and debt investments. They're laying the foundation for their future in tech.
It's targeted too, right? It's not just like throwing money around.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources highlight where it's all going. AI robots, better biomanufacturing, advanced materials, even drones.
That's right.
It's like they're building a complete independent AI world from the ground up.
I think that's a great way to put it. The end goal, they're saying, is a strong AI financial ecosystem. Not just funding companies, but creating this whole environment where research and development can thrive, where AI can actually be used everywhere, and where the financial tools exist to keep AI growing for a long time, across all kinds of industries, too.
That's huge.
It is, and of course, the U.S. isn't just sitting back and watching.
Right, enter the Stargate project.
Yeah, Stargate, it's their big countermove. They're saying it involves something like $500 billion in private investment, all for building up the U.S.'s own AI infrastructure.
Okay, so what does that actually mean? What are they building?
Think of it like this. They're creating the basic building blocks. Giant data centers to train AI, the super important semiconductors that make AI work, the cloud services that let people access and use it. Big names are involved in this. OpenAI, Oracle, SoftBank,
Yeah, I've heard of those guys.
Of course. And this is all on top of what those huge American tech companies are already spending, too.
Oh, right, like Google and Amazon.
Exactly. By the end of this year, 2024, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, they're all expected to have put in, combined, around $222 billion just in capital expenses for AI. Those are massive numbers. It really shows you how serious both sides are about winning this AI race.
Okay, so we've got a sense of the players and how much money they're throwing around. But this is where it gets super interesting for our listener, right? It's not just about spending, it's about strategy. And one thing that really jumps out from these sources is China's open source AI offensive.
Yeah, this is a fascinating strategy and potentially a really disruptive one. China is releasing a ton of open source AI models this year in 2025.
And it's working, right?
Yeah.
There was that company DeepSeek that everyone was talking about, a startup spun off from, get this, a hedge fund, High Flyer, I think it was called. Anyway, they launched their DeepSeek R1 back in January.
Right, a big deal.
A big deal. They say it's this advanced reasoning large language model, or LLM, basically super powerful AI that's learned from a ton of text. And the aim is to go head-to-head with OpenAI's O1, be able to do math, code, complex reasoning, all that.
It's a direct challenge for sure.
And then you have Alibaba, another giant, releasing the Qwen 2.5 VL family in February.
I was just reading about that.
These are vision language models, so they work with text, images, and video, and they come in different sizes, the largest one with a mind-blowing 72 billion parameters. And parameters, well, think of them like the controls that an AI uses to learn and make decisions. So more parameters often means a more complex, more capable AI. And get this, the 72 billion parameter version apparently beat some of OpenAI and Google's latest models in some tests.
That is significant.
So it's not just about more models, it's about models that can really compete. you know?
Absolutely. And Baidu, another huge player in Chinese tech, joined the game in March, too.
Right.
They released Ernie 4.5, which works with different types of data at the same time, like text and images.
Yeah.
And they also released Ernie X1, which is all about deep thinking and reasoning.
I'm already getting lost in all these names.
And there's more coming.
There is.
DeepSeek R2, Ernie 5, Manus AI. Looks like they're really committed to this strategy.
So what does it all mean? What's the potential impact of all these open source models for, for our listener?
Well, the sources suggest this could be a strategic move to shake up the Western AI software market. If these open source models become good enough for a lot of different uses, it could put a real squeeze on companies like OpenAI or Google who are trying to make money from their AI.
Yeah, because those companies have to spend a fortune to train their models. They need to make that money back somehow.
Exactly. China's strategy seems to be about making the AI software more accessible, almost like tuning it into a commodity.
Mm.
And it plays to their strengths, right? They're already masters of hardware manufacturing. Think about solar panels, electronics, even electric vehicles. They've been so successful at making things affordably.
Right.
So now, if they pair low-cost or even free AI models with their hardware, it could really change the game,
Yeah.
especially in terms of being able to offer lower prices than Western companies.
And that's what happened with DeepSeek R1, right? Didn't it cause like $1 trillion dip in the value of U.S. tech companies?
Yeah, at least temporarily. It shows that the Western markets are starting to see the potential impact of these open source initiatives. They're starting to realize that China could change the whole playing field.
And all of that leads us to hardware, which, as the sources point out, is a huge advantage for China in this whole competition.
Absolutely. Their manufacturing base is so efficient and well established, it gives them a real leg up in making affordable devices with AI built in. Everything from smart home stuff to drones, robots, smartphones, laptops, you name it.
And if they can combine these chip hardware capabilities with those easily accessible, affordable AI models, they could seriously undercut Western companies who are still mostly focused on making money from the software side of things.
That's the idea.
The BYD story really shows this, doesn't it?
It does.
They actually surpassed Tesla in revenue last year in 2024.
Yeah, I heard about that.
BYD reported $107 billion compared to Tesla's $97.7 billion. And while their profit margins might not be quite at Tesla's level yet, they're growing much faster.
That's what's really key here. It's not just about the current numbers, it's about the trends. BYD's revenue is growing like crazy at 27% a year. Tesla, on the other hand, is only at 1%. And look at their market caps. BYD at $160 billion, Tesla's still at a massive $900 billion, but those trends suggest things could shift.
It's almost like a changing of the guard, right?
Fine way.
And BYD isn't just about making a lot of cars. They're innovating too, with their super fast battery charging tech and all those driver assist features they have. Did you hear about the name they gave them? Eyes of God.
Eyes of God.
Yeah. And they've already become the 6th biggest car maker in the world, passing companies like Honda. It shows that Chinese companies aren't just making things in huge numbers, they're coming up with new ideas, being really competitive, a real challenge for American and other global companies.
No doubt. And even Tesla sees this. They're feeling the heat, not just from BYD, but from those established German and Japanese car makers, too. So they're looking to markets like India for future growth.
Which brings us to U.S. counter-strategies and how India is becoming more and more important in this whole thing.
Yeah, India is key. With over 1.4 billion people and a ton of skilled workers, they're becoming a crucial player in this global power game. The sources we have suggest the U.S. is trying to get closer to India, seeing them as a major potential trading partner and a way to balance China's growing influence in the region.
Makes sense.
They're thinking if the U.S. can maybe use tariffs and other economic tools, they could encourage India to open up more to American goods and services.
Yeah.
Lower those trade barriers.
And we're already seeing some big partnerships forming between Indian and American companies, right?
Oh, yeah. Quite a few, actually.
Like what? Fill me in.
Well, Tata Group, for example, is reportedly working with Tesla on their global supply chain. That could be a big deal for Tesla, helping them get into the Indian market and maybe even lower their production costs.
Yeah.
And Tata Communications is partnering with NVIDIA to create India's own AI cloud infrastructure using NVIDIA's really powerful Hooper GPUs. Reliance Industries is apparently looking into working with Meta and the people behind ChatGPT to make affordable AI specifically for the Indian market.
Wow.
And even in terms of just connecting people, Reliance Jio and Party Airtel have joined up with Starlink for satellite internet. Even ISRO, India's space agency, is working with SpaceX and NASA. All these partnerships point to a growing bond between the U.S. and India, and they're becoming more and more reliant on each other.
So zooming out a bit, for our listener, what are the main things we should take away from all this? Because it seems like a pretty complex situation that's changing all the time.
It really is. Well, it doesn't seem like China's going to totally knock the U.S. off its top spot in the world anytime soon. It's definitely the biggest and most serious challenge the U.S. has faced in a century, at least according to these sources. And we have to remember that China has its own problems to deal with.
Like what?
Things like potential deflation, an aging population, a big debt burden, and that whole middle income trap thing.
Right. So it's not like China has it all figured out.
Not at all. But this rivalry is fundamentally different from, say, the Cold War with the Soviet Union. A lot of these sources made that point.
In what way?
Well, China isn't just some ideological enemy. It's a real powerhouse in tech and industry. They have this massive, interconnected manufacturing base, and they're advancing really fast in a lot of different tech areas. This makes the rivalry much more complicated and nuanced than those old power struggles.
And it's not just a two-player game anymore either. These sources talk about a third pole emerging.
Right.
Countries like Russia, India, Israel, the Gulf states, they could become really important in balancing global power.
Exactly. These countries have their own interests, and they can choose to side with either the U.S. or China on certain issues, or even go their own way. It makes the whole situation much more unpredictable. And as one source said, the great game in Asia, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, is just getting started.
It really feels like we're at the beginning of something huge, right? Like the first few scenes of that Battle Royale movie we were talking about.
I think so.
So, to sum it all up for our listener, in this deep dive, we've looked at the intense competition between the US and China in AI and other technologies. We talked about the massive amounts of money they're both spending. We looked at China's interesting approach of developing open source AI while using their strong manufacturing capabilities to their advantage.
Right.
And we discussed how the U.S. is trying to counter these moves, especially by getting closer to countries like India. And we touched on how all this could have some really big long-term effects on the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So, listener, here's something to think about. Given how fast technology is changing and all the strategic moves we've talked about, what do you think will happen to the global economy and the tech landscape over the next 10 years? What unexpected things might come out of this battle royale that could affect not just the U.S. and China, but everyone else?
Yeah, it's a big question.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's one we all need to consider as this great game continues to unfold and reshape the world around us.
Definitely something to keep our eyes on.
For sure.
And our ears open, too.
Absolutely.